November on the Kansas plains has its own particular gravity. The sky goes wide and gray. The fields have already given everything they had, and the towns along Highway 56 carry the specific quiet of places that have decided to remain even as the reasons for remaining become harder to articulate. Staff Sergeant Vera Lomas had been driving from Dodge City to her sister's place in Great Bend when she stopped for fuel at a station outside Larned, and the old man inside, buying a coffee, wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose body had been renegotiating terms for years, had talked to her for 7 minutes. While the pump ran, he had talked about the weather, about the way November used to feel different on this stretch of highway, about a dog he'd had named Clarence. Moss had been in the back seat, listening. 2 weeks later, driving back the same way, Vera had seen a handwritten notice taped to the inside of the gas station window. George Aldis, 89, laid to rest Nov. 14. Funeral services, 10 a.m. Larned Municipal Cemetery. It was November 14th. It was 9:40. In the passenger seat, Moss lifted his head and set his chin on the window ledge and looked at the road ahead with the expression of a dog who has already decided something. Vera pulled into the cemetery at 9:58. She and Moss were the only ones there. What she discovered over the following 8 days, about who George Aldis had been, about what he had done and what had been done to him, and about a daughter in Wichita who had not known her father was dead, would confirm something Vera had believed since her first tour and had never found the words for: that a life fully lived is worth being witnessed, even after it ends. Especially then. If this is the kind of story you stay for, subscribe now and stay with me through what 8 days of asking looked like. Vera had joined the Marines at 21 after 3 years working for her uncle's surveying company in western Kansas, and arriving at the conclusion that she wanted to go somewhere where the stakes of paying attention were legible. She had served 12 years, combat logistics and then force protection, and had come back to Kansas in 2020 with a retirement she hadn't expected to take at 33 and a right knee that had contributed its own opinion to the timing. She drove the highway now for a nonprofit that served rural veterans across southwestern Kansas, the counties where the nearest VA office was 90 miles away and the nearest peer support group required a 2-hour round trip that not everyone could afford in fuel or time. She knew what isolation looked like in the plains. She had grown up in it. She drove toward it every week with Moss in the back seat, and a list of names, and a willingness to stay in a conversation as long as it needed to go. Moss was a 6-year-old blue heeler, speckled gray and white, one brown eye and one blue. Compact and tireless in the way of cattle dogs who have been bred for sustained work in open country and who do not distinguish between that work and all other work. He was not a large dog, but he occupied a room in the complete way of a dog whose attention is total, and the quality of his presence. The blue eye and the brown eye both on you, the specific alertness of a breed that makes its assessments quickly and holds them firmly, had the effect of making people feel seen in a way that Vera had learned to let work before she started talking. He slept at the foot of her bed and got up 30 seconds before her alarm and waited, which was a thing she had never asked him to do and which he had never stopped doing, and she had come to understand this as the daily evidence of a dog who had decided that wherever she was going, being ready was what he owed. George Aldis had been 89 years old. He had lived in Larned, Kansas, county seat of Pawnee County, population 4,000, the kind of town where the grain elevator is taller than any other structure, and where families have been farming the same sections of land for 4 and 5 generations, for 61 years. He had come to Larned in 1963 as a young man who had served 2 years in Korea, and who had found in the flat geometry of Pawnee County something that suited the particular cast of his temperament: space, quiet, the visible consequence of work, and no one requiring him to be louder or more sociable than he naturally was. He had farmed wheat and sorghum for 30 years on a section 9 miles north of town, a section he worked alone after Pearl got sick, and worked alone still after Pearl died, because the fields were the conversation he knew how to have, and the one that never disappointed him. He was known at the grain elevator by his truck before he was known by his face. He had coffee at the gas station most mornings at the same time, and Bettina had it poured by the time he came through the door. And this had been true since 1987 and would have remained true until he stopped coming through the door, which was how it ended. He had been, by the account of the neighbors Vera would talk to in the days after the funeral, a man of complete reliability. If he said something would be done, it was done. If he said he would be somewhere, he was there. And the specific trust that this kind of consistency builds in a small rural community had made him, across 60 years, the kind of man people called when the other options had been exhausted. He had never called attention to this. He had simply been available, in the way of certain men who understand that availability is a form of love that does not require announcement. His wife Pearl had died in 2014. He had a daughter named Darlene who had moved to Wichita in 1998 and who had stopped calling sometime around 2017 after a dispute about the farm's inheritance that had begun as a disagreement and hardened across 4 years of unresolved legal correspondence into a silence that neither of them had found the right words to end. He had a neighbor named Chet Rucker, 74, who had farmed the adjacent section for 30 years and who had checked on George every Thursday, and who had been the person who found him on a Tuesday morning in early November, peacefully in the chair by the kitchen window with his coffee mug in his hand and the first light coming across the fields. Chet had called the county and made the arrangements and taped the notice to the gas station window, because the gas station was where people in Larned went, and because he didn't know what else to do. Nobody had come to the funeral except Vera Lomas and her dog. Chet Rucker had been there when she arrived. She had seen him by the grave, an older man in a good coat, who looked up when she walked across the wet grass and who said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You knew him?" Vera said she had talked to him twice. Chet said, "That's more than most, this last while." He said it without bitterness, in the flat factual tone of the plains, and Vera understood that it was simply the truth, and that its flatness was its own kind of grief. Have you ever stood at someone's graveside and realized that the most important thing you could do for them wasn't grieve, it was go find out who they were? If that moment has been part of your life, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. After the service, the county's chaplain, 10 minutes, the specific brevity of a ceremony with no family to extend it, Vera drove back to the gas station and talked to the woman behind the counter, who had known George for 20 years and whose name was Bettina, and who said yes, he came in most mornings. Yes, he always had the Korean War cap. And then, carefully, because Bettina was the kind of person who is careful about the feelings of the dead, he had medals, you know. He never talked about them, but Chet told me once. From Korea. Vera went to Chet Rucker's house. She also went to the Lutheran church on Broadway, where a woman named Marta, who had been the church's secretary for 23 years, said George had attended for 30 of them, had not missed an Easter in 30 years, had repaired the church's exterior steps twice without being asked and without being paid, and had sat in the 4th pew on the left every Sunday until Pearl died, and in the 5th pew after that, because the 4th pew had been theirs, and he was not yet ready to sit in it alone, but was not ready to leave it behind entirely either. Marta said this without being asked for it. She said it because Vera had asked who George Aldous was, and Marta knew and had been waiting, she said, for someone to come and ask. was the kind of farmer who kept things in order and who could find documents from 30 years ago in a filing cabinet that he could describe in advance by drawer. He had, in that filing cabinet, a copy of something George had asked him to hold in 1987. A plain brown envelope sealed and labeled in George's handwriting, in case. He had never opened it because it said in case and the case hadn't come. And then George had died on a Tuesday, and Chet had made the arrangements, and the case had arrived, and he hadn't known what to do with it. He handed it to Vera because she had asked, and because he was 74 and had been holding it for 37 years and was ready for someone else to be responsible for whatever it contained. Inside the envelope was a Silver Star citation, a Bronze Star citation, a Purple Heart certificate, a discharge paper that recorded George Aldis's service with the 7th Infantry Division in Korea from 1951 to 1953, and that noted, in the specific language of official documents, a commendation for action at the Battle of Triangle Hill in October 1952, an engagement that Vera, who had read military history the way some people read fiction, recognized immediately as one of the most sustained and costly infantry actions of the Korean War. She sat in Chet's kitchen for a moment with the documents in her hands. Moss, who had been lying near the back door, stood up and walked to the table and put his chin on her knee and looked at her with both eyes, the brown one and the blue one, and stayed. What George Aldis had done at Triangle Hill in October 1952 was in the citation. What the citation described was a specific act of sustained exposure under fire to retrieve 2 wounded soldiers from a position that had been overrun, performed over the course of 4 hours at night on a hillside in North Korea, and George had been 22 years old when he did it. He had received the Silver Star for it. He had come home to Kansas and farmed wheat and sorghum and told no one, because that was who he was, and the medals had gone into a brown envelope in Chet Rucker's filing cabinet for 37 years. The urgency arrived not from a deadline, but from Darlene. Vera found Darlene's name in a county probate filing that Chet had been notified about, a routine notification that the estate required a next-of-kin response within 30 days. Chet had not known Darlene's current contact information. Vera found her through the Wichita phone listings on a Tuesday afternoon and called the number and listened to it ring 4 times, and then heard a woman's voice. Vera said, "My name is Vera Lomas. I was wondering if you are Darlene Aldis." There was a pause. "Aldis was my maiden name," the woman said. "Your father passed away on November 7th, Vera said. "I thought you should know." The sound on the other end of the line was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of a person receiving information that rearranges something structural, not loud, but with weight. The specific silence of a door closing that you did not know was still open. Darlene drove to Larned on Thursday. She had not spoken to her father in 5 years, though she had thought about calling him, had thought about it with the specific frequency of people who have a thing they mean to do that they keep not doing, who measure its importance by how often it occurs to them, rather than by whether they act. She had not known about the Silver Star. She had not known about the Brown Star or the Purple Heart. She had known her father was a veteran, and that he had been in Korea, and that he did not talk about it, which was the total of what he had told her, and she had understood, growing up, that this was not reticence, but discipline. The specific discipline of a man who had decided that what happened on a hillside in North Korea in 1952 belonged to him and to the men who had been there, and was not a story for the kitchen table. Vera met her at the gas station. Bettina had coffee ready and sat with her for 3 hours and told her everything she had found in 8 days of asking, the Silver Star and what it was for, Triangle Hill and what happened there, the 37 years in Chet's filing cabinet, the notice taped to the window, The 10-minute funeral with the county chaplain and 2 people and a dog in a wet November cemetery. Darlene listened. She held the Silver Star citation in her hands. Vera had brought the documents, and she read it twice. And her face did the thing that faces do when they are receiving something true about someone they loved and failed and are now being given back. She was not crying. She was very still, in the way of a person absorbing something that cannot be absorbed quickly, and she was reading the citation the way her father would have wanted someone to read it, carefully, with full attention, treating the facts as the facts deserved to be treated. She said, "He never said anything." "No," Vera said. "He could have told me." She looked at the citation. Why didn't he tell me? Vera thought about that. She thought about the men she had known who came back from places and did not talk about them. Not because the places weren't worth discussing, but because certain experiences close surround themselves. And describing them to someone who wasn't there requires either a listener who understands or a speaker willing to be misunderstood. And George Aldis had been a man who preferred silence to being misunderstood. She said, "I think he told the Fields." 30 years of farming a section in Pawnee County. That's a conversation. It just doesn't use words. Darlene looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Moss, who had come to sit beside her chair with the specific settled presence of a dog who has decided that this person needs the full weight of company and is providing it. She put her hand on his back. The villain of this story had no face. The way certain wrongs have no face. The dispute that hardened into silence. The years that became 5 years. The assumption on both sides that the door was still there and could be opened later, when there turned out to be no later. George had not been wronged by a person with a scheme. He had been wronged by time and by the accumulated weight of a silence that both sides had been waiting for the other to break. Vera could not confront this. She could only witness it and help Darlene begin the process of carrying it differently. What happened in the weeks that followed was the kind of thing that happens when a woman from Wichita arrives in a town of 4,000 and stays for a week. Darlene worked with a Veterans Heritage Organization to ensure that George's service record, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, was entered into the county's Permanent Veterans Memorial Database. She spoke at the Larned VFW Post about her father, at the invitation of the post commander, and read the Silver Star citation aloud, and the room was the kind of quiet that rooms are when something true has been said in a space designed to hold it. She had her father's medals framed. She brought them back to the house on the section 9 miles north of town and hung them in the kitchen where George had sat by the window with his coffee every morning for 60 years. She called Chet Rucker every Sunday. Vera drove back through Larned in December. She stopped at the gas station. Bettina had coffee ready, which Vera had begun to understand as a constant, and drove out to the section and sat in her truck at the end of the drive for a few minutes, looking at the farmhouse with George's truck still in the yard and the fields going dormant under the first hard freeze of the season. Moss pressed his nose to the windshield and looked at the fields with the specific quality of attention he gave to open terrain. Tracking, taking inventory, the healer's habit of accounting for what was there. She thought about George Aldis talking to her at the pump for 7 minutes about the weather and November and a dog named Clarence. She thought about a hillside in North Korea in 1952 and a 22-year-old from Pawnee County who went back for 2 men over 4 hours in the dark and received a Silver Star and a brown envelope in 60 years of Kansas fields and never said a word about any of it. She thought about the specific shape of a life that holds everything important inside itself, that does not advertise, that simply shows up and works and is present until it isn't, and that deserves, on the other side of its ending, to be seen. She had stopped because the pump needed running. Moss had set his chin on the window ledge. She had been 2 minutes from passing through without stopping. Nobody would have known. She knew. This story is for every veteran who came home and kept what they did to themselves, who folded the citations and put them away and got on with things, quietly, for 60 years. It is also for everyone who has a silence with someone they love that has lasted longer than they meant it to. The door may still be there. Is there a George Aldous in your life? Or was there? Someone whose story you only partly know? Someone whose service was never fully witnessed? Type their name in the comments. Let's fill this section with people who deserved to be seen. Every story on this channel is about refusing to let a life go undescribed. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.